afternoon, everybody. It's great to see such a fantastic turnout, and I know from all of the emails that we've had from Martin what a huge amount of organisation has gone into organising today. So thank you very much to Southwark Homeowners Council for that work as well, and for the opportunity to get everybody together. I'm going to speak about a few things this afternoon. So I am one of the Southwark Members of Parliament. I represent Dulwich and West Norwood, which covers the Dulwich part of Southwark and also stretches into Lambeth as well. And before I was the local MP, I was one of the councillors for what was then College Ward going back 2010. So I've represented a small part of Southwark for 10 years now, and the rest of my constituency for the last 5 years, since 2015. But probably more significantly than that, for what we're talking about today, for the last 5 years I've been a member of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, which has the role in Parliament of scrutinising the work of government on everything to do with housing. And leasehold and leasehold related issues have been quite a large part of our work over that period. And so the main thing that I'm going to talk about is an inquiry that we ran in the last Parliament, and the recommendations that, as a cross-party select committee, having looked at a great deal of evidence about leasehold and the problems with it and the impact that the current legal framework has on leaseholders' lives in the day-to-day, the recommendations that we made to the government about reforms that are needed. I thought I'd also talk a little bit about cladding, which is an enormous issue. I don't think we can overstate the implications of cladding for the housing sector broadly and for leaseholders as well in the short term, and some of the action that I think is needed in relation to that. And then just a couple of thoughts about some other reforms that weren't included in the Select Committee report, but which I think would be a good idea as far as leasehold is concerned. So I just came in at the end of the last presentations, and I heard Catherine using the word feudal. And I think that is a good word to use in relation to leasehold. I think we are looking at an area of property law which is completely outdated and not fit for purpose for the job that it's trying to do. And I think that all of the problems that leaseholders experience in terms of large bills, in terms of the way that service charges are constructed, in terms of the difficulty that you have sometimes in raising issues with landlords and getting action taken, fundamentally those problems all stem from a legal framework which is not fit for purpose. And so in terms of the work of Parliament on this issue, what a group of MPs, myself included, are arguing for very strongly is that we need comprehensive reform of leasehold, and that relates to some of the recommendations that we made as a select committee as well. But I just first of all wanted to say that absolutely, as a constituency MP and before that as a local councillor, I have seen how difficult, particularly large service charge bills, can be for leaseholders, and I completely understand that those impacts go beyond the financial and are often, can become the kind of all-consuming stress and anxiety in people's lives. Absolutely know that. The route to sorting it out, I think, is in the campaigning work that you are doing and in getting a legislative change for the government to put leaseholders in a much fairer position in relation to the property law as it stands at the moment. So our select committee took evidence from leaseholders, from many of the organisations that work on behalf of leaseholders. We took some evidence from freeholders and surveyors and some of the professional bodies and all sorts of people who have an interest in this area. It was one of the the inquiries that I worked on that had the highest level of engagement from the public, and I think something that's quite technical fundamentally. I think that took lots of committee members by surprise, that there was so much interest in what we were doing on leasehold. And so we took evidence, written evidence, we took evidence in the select committee, informal evidence sessions. We also ran some workshop sessions to invite leaseholders in to participate as well. So it probably took place over about 6 months. And so these were our conclusions. So we concluded, partly because when we had the workshop sessions, the biggest round of applause in the feedback from those sessions were when somebody stood up and said, well, in our group we just discussed that we should abolish leasehold. Yes. And so having looked at the evidence, that was sort of our conclusion too. So we concluded as a select committee that common hold should become the primary model of ownership for flats. And that leasehold for houses should be abolished completely. Common hold was introduced previously by a Labour government, and we looked and we had some thoughts about why common hold hasn't been taken up in the way that was intended and was hoped at the time. And essentially you get back to ground rent as the problem for that for as long as there is a financial interest that freeholders can derive from ground rent, the incentive in the system not to encourage and facilitate the shift to common hold is very difficult. There are a separate set of issues for local authority leaseholders around common hold, I think, as well. But that was our top recommendation, was that leasehold is not fit for purpose and should be replaced by a form of tenure which essentially removes the kind of profit-making middleman from the leasehold system. We also recommended that the Competition and Markets Authority should investigate, as a matter of urgency, mis-selling in the leasehold sector, and some of that work is now happening, I'm pleased to say. But and that also as part of that investigation, appropriate recommendations should be made for compensation for leaseholders who have experienced the very worst of the exploitative, the doubling of ground rents and the selling on of freeholds to often to kind of offshore companies before those leaseholders had the right to buy their own freehold. But there's a whole area of very, very, very murky practice there that needed to be investigated. We had some recommendations that related to the point of sale for leasehold and to just trying to make sure that anybody who is purchasing a leasehold property is as well informed and well equipped as they possibly can be about the potential financial implications of taking on leasehold under current law. And we had lots of evidence from the legal sector about really the lack of information that was provided. We had lots of evidence from leaseholders who were saying, when I bought my flat, I thought I was buying my flat. I didn't know that I didn't own the windows. I didn't know that I didn't own the front door. I didn't know that the freeholder could come along and present me with a bill for an order of magnitude of tens of thousands of pounds, and that was perfectly legal, and there wasn't very much that could be done about it. So we really felt that consumer interface within the conveyancing sector, if you're buying a leasehold property, you should be absolutely clear about what you are buying, what the obligations are that you're taking on, and have to, I think, new obligations on the legal sector to confirm that certain information has been passed to leaseholders at the point of sale, and that those leaseholders have fully understood the implications of what they are taking on. So we recommended a kind of standardised key features document that should be available to leaseholders at the point of sale, that sets out very clearly what the tenure is, that the length of the lease, the ground rent, any commission fees, and if it's appropriate, the price at which the developer is seeking to sell the freehold within 6 months, if that particular rule applies. We recommended that the government should prohibit the offering of financial incentives to persuade a customer to use a particular solicitor. That refers to a practice that we found very common amongst new build properties, where there were various discounts being offered on legal fees by the developer in return for using a particular solicitor. And we saw some quite disturbing evidence about the kind of collusion between legal practices and developers, including kind of social media evidence about Christmas parties that were being held together, and that relationships that were far too close between the development industry and the legal sector. And that is not appropriate, doesn't deliver good outcomes for leaseholders, and we felt needed to end. We thought that the government should legislate to reform ground rents, and eliminate ground rents for houses altogether. We couldn't see any need for that practice to continue. Certainly didn't see any need at all for the doubling ground rents issue, the escalating ground rents issue to continue for a moment longer. And with regard to flats, our recommendation as a cross-party committee was that ground rents should be limited to 0.1% of the present value of the property up to a maximum of £250 and no more than that, with no provision for ongoing increases of ground rents. And that we also discovered on the basis of legal advice that it was perfectly possible for the government to introduce that reform, which previously it had been argued was difficult. We recommended that government should legislate to restrict onerous permission fees, and our recommendation was very strong on that. So we said that permission fees, so people know what permission fees are, so it's if you're making kind of any kind of minor modification to your home, quite often there's a provision in the lease, I think less commonly local authority leases, that you have to seek permission from the freeholder to do that, and that the freeholder can charge a fee just for saying yes, you can paint your front door. We thought that permission fees should only be charged when it is reasonable to do so and when it's absolutely necessary, but we also said that we couldn't think of any circumstances where that was in fact the case. We recommended that the Competition and Markets Authority should indicate whether onerous leasehold terms constitute unfair terms and therefore couldn't be enforced in law. So we thought particularly with regard to the very exploitative practice around ground rents for houses and some of the leasehold practice on houses, very common less common in London, very common in other parts of the country, it was possible that just on the reasonable test those terms could be ruled null and void, but that needed the Competition and Markets Authority to look at it. We recommended a standardised form for all service charges to improve the kind of transparency and the clarity of the basis on which service charges are billed. And we recommended a new consultation process for leaseholders affected by major works in privately owned buildings, and I can talk a bit about why that's a bit more complicated in local authority owned buildings, with a threshold of £10,000 above which major works couldn't be charged unless a majority of leaseholders agreed to those major works. The reason that's difficult in local authority buildings, and we didn't apply that recommendation to local authority buildings, is because of the relationship to local authority tenants and leaseholders in the same buildings, and we didn't think it was fair that what is often a minority of leaseholders in a building could stop works that might be essential, that a majority of tenants might want to go ahead. And that isn't to say, and I'll come on to other ways in which charges for leaseholders in local authority buildings might be limited. It's not because we didn't think that there was a case for that, but that particular recommendation we applied only to private buildings that were owned privately. Coming on to local authority leaseholders and limiting costs, we looked at the question of Florey's Law, which is widely considered to have been ineffective in protecting leaseholders against excessive major works charges. And we thought that Florey's Law should be less limited and should have much wider applications. That needs to come with government funding so that the costs of major works can be met. Florey's Law has the potential to protect leaseholders against major works charges and has done so in a relatively small number of cases. But it has to come with that. There has to be government funding for the major works to plug the gap in order to enable that protection for leaseholders. We recommended that there should be reform of the redress system. So we took extensive evidence about how difficult the tribunal system is for leaseholders and how, on the whole, it's considered not to work. And I've certainly seen those examples myself of the disparity in legal representation, the disparity in the ability of a large freehold organisation to pay legal fees versus an individual leaseholder who's already possibly been financially crippled by large costs already. We didn't make explicit recommendations in our report because in other reports we had made recommendations about housing redress and support for, so we think that the government should introduce a housing court, which is a specialist court to deal with all matters to do with housing, including leasehold, and that would be both a more robust system and a more specialist and reliable system for leaseholders. We thought the government should legislate to make enfranchisement cheaper and provide low interest loans for leaseholders who want to enfranchise. So for leaseholders who want to buy a proportion of the freehold for their buildings, they should be able to do that on a low interest loan basis funded by the government. And we made some recommendations also about further work that the Law Commission should do in relation to leasehold legislation. I want to just come on now quickly to the question of cladding post-Grenfell, and I think this is an issue that has such wide-reaching implications. And if I can say, I think the government's response to date falls very far short of being adequate in relation to cladding. So we have so far a situation where the particular type of cladding that was used in Grenfell Tower, which contributed to the catastrophic spread of the fire there, has been required by government to be removed, and the government has made funding available to remove that cladding. But we then have two other things going on. So that's a type of cladding called ACM cladding. It is absolutely known that ACM cladding is not the only flammable form of cladding. But there is no funding for the removal of other flammable forms of cladding from the government at the moment. And then the other complication relates to Advice Note 14 produced by the government in relation to cladding, which requires freeholders to get certification that the cladding used in their building is safe. But they are reliant on a government testing programme for a whole enormous range of different products to be able to get that certification. And that really isn't working for people. So I have examples in my constituency of privately owned blocks where there are leaseholders wanting to sell who essentially can't sell because they can't sell because that certification isn't in place, and therefore they don't know in any formal sense whether the cladding that is on their building is safe or not. So I think we need two things to happen very urgently in relation to cladding. The first is that the government must fund it. It must fund cladding replacement. We went round and round in the committee looking at, and I noticed I'm not on the committee anymore, but I noticed they just launched this week a separate inquiry just looking at the issue of cladding. But we went round and round the kind of possible solutions, and there is, essentially we concluded that it isn't going to be good enough or effective enough just to tell freeholders that they have to do it. Lots of freeholders can't easily be identified, they're offshore entities, lots of freehold organisations don't have the money for that replacement. And the law as it stands at the moment, the strongest thing in leasehold law is leases, which require a proportion of the cost to be charged back to leaseholders. So we're in a situation with cladding that simply isn't fair, and actually quite often isn't fair to freeholders either. So I think the situation with a lot of cladding is that nobody was doing anything wrong at the time. People were using products that were approved for the purpose, that were considered to be safe, having gone through the proper permissions for using those products. And then we've subsequently found out that those products were not safe and that there's a problem. That isn't anybody's fault, and the usual approach to problems that aren't anybody's fault is that actually the government needs to step in and plug that gap and avoid a situation where people are being unfairly penalised, potentially with catastrophic financial consequences as a result of the cladding situation. And then the other thing that the government urgently needs to do is to step up its game with regard to testing of products. And that's a role for government because as a consequence of Grenfell Tower there has also been an enormous collapse in confidence in the wider testing industries. This can't be left to the sector. there's a lack of confidence in the sector, and there's a lack of confidence within the sector about the basis on which building products are now certified. So the government has to step in. We have to have much more transparency about the testing, and we have to have much more clarity about which products present a risk and which products do not present a risk with regard to external wall cladding. So those are some thoughts, but there's quite a lot of action in Parliament on this, a lot of pressure on the government, and it was relatively encouraging for me on the committee in the last Parliament that Conservative colleagues were also making the case that ultimately government was going to have to pay for this problem, and so why weren't they just accepting that reality now and giving the clarity and the comfort to people that those costs would be met. So I'll stop there really. I think that the recommendations that we made were wide-ranging. They were very well received by the leasehold sector and lots of the organisations that work on behalf of the leasehold sector. It is now for the government to respond to those recommendations and hopefully to accept them and to implement them and to make time within its legislative programme for the changes that we urgently need for leaseholders to be made. Thank you.